funds off of my stack. Money.
Today's lesson is going to come from Chapter 27, the Basic Tools of Finance. As you guys know, we've been looking through various parts of our economy, and as of late we've really focused mostly on the financial sector. And I want to keep looking at the financial sector because this is like a really important part of the macroeconomy and ultimately a really important part of this class. So Chapter 27, the Basic Tools of Finance, introduces us to a way that we can actually mathematically look at how our money can grow. Well, let's start off by just defining finance. Finance is a discipline that looks at how people can make money off of money, or the various tools and instruments, financial instruments, that exist to allow us to do this. It's the field of study that looks at how people make decisions about their future relative to their income, financial savings and investments, and ultimately how to prepare for a future point in their life where they may need to draw on some money or combat inflation or something of that nature. And it's a huge part of our society today. It's an extremely large part of our society and our economy. So there's some things we're going to be looking at as we go through this chapter, but ultimately this chapter will show us how mathematically money and income can grow and ultimately attain larger amounts in the future based on interest rates. Alright, so let's say that one of your friends comes to you and says, I need to borrow $100. And you agree to lend them $100, right? You say, okay, I am willing to give you $100. It's not a problem. The thing is that I'm going to want some interest in the future, right? Like I'm going to want to make something off of this transaction. And so let's just say that you guys agree upon a 3% interest rate. In other words, that you agree that once this money is paid back, the original principal amount of the money, the $100, will be paid back, and in addition to the $100 will be a 3% return. Okay, so let's say that we have the $100 times 3%, and I know that in 1 year's time, when this loan matures, that this $100 principal at 3% interest will grow to be $103. So subsequently, off this transaction, I've made $3 in interest. So based on this interest rate, the future value of this $100 in 1 year's time is $103. Said another way, if I was to look at this $103 1 year from now, today it is actually worth $100. So I have here both the present value of a future sum and the future value of a present sum. And so what we're going to look at is some of the different formulas that allow us to see how this works, and then in addition to that, some of the various forms of interest as well. Okay, so let's return to the PowerPoint here, and I want to define a couple of things. First of all, future value. When we talk about the future value of a sum, it's essentially the money that you have today and what that sum can actually grow to in a future time period. And to understand that, we go back to our original example of the $100 borrowed. $100 today is the same thing to me as $103 in a year from now, so long as I earn that 3% interest. If I loan someone $100 and I get 3% on it, I know that in a year's time it's going to be worth to me a future value sum of $103. If I want to sort of reverse this process, I can look at a notion known as present value. And the present value is essentially what some future form of money is worth in its value today. Or that $103 that we loaned to somebody, we know that $103 a year from now is worth $100 today, if that interest rate is 3%. Okay, so let's talk about various forms of interest and interest rates. First of all, we have a type of interest known as simple interest. And simple interest is calculated based on the principal amount only. The formula for simple interest is sort of simple. It is P times R times T, where the P stands for principal, the R stands for the rate, or the interest rate, and the T stands for the time. So the P, the principal, that's the original amount that you invest. The rate is the interest rate that you will earn on that money. And the T represents the time that you have invested in that money. Now, simple interest is not the type of interest that you would prefer if you had your money in some sort of financial instrument. As a matter of fact, there's actually a better type of interest that grows not just arithmetically, but also it grows exponentially. And that type of interest rate is called compounding interest. Now, the miracle of compounding interest is that not only does your principal amount grow, but also any future interest will grow as well. And this led Albert Einstein to say that compounding interest was the most powerful force in the universe. But compounding interest allows for both principal and interest to earn interest. So essentially, the principal and any interest earned on that principal is now earning interest as well. Okay, so let's look at the formula for compounding interest. A little bit of algebra helps us to understand how this works. Here's the formula. The formula is the sum of a future value is equal to P times 1 plus the rate to the nth power. Again, the future value is equal to P times 1 plus R to the nth power. All right, so let's sort of dissect what each one of these things are. Again, the P is the principal. The R is the interest rate plus 1, which is a reflection of the principal times the interest rate, to the nth power, which is the number of times compounded. All right, so let's look at the difference between simple and compounding interest using an example here. If you would, grab a calculator so that you can work along with me as we solve these problems. Okay, so these problems are essentially asking us to look at both simple and compounding perspective. Our first example here, we have the future value of $1,000 using simple interest. So here's our principal, here's our rate, here's our time. So we would, again, take this $1,000, multiply it by the rate, which is 0.2, and then multiply it by the total amount of years. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and come over here to my calculator, and I'm going to take the 1,000 times 0.2 multiplied by the amount of time, and I can see that the total interest earned on this account, on this amount here, would be $2,000. Okay, so I would have $2,000 in interest. $2,000 in interest. So when I make this investment, I know that I will have earned, over the course of 10 years, $2,000. Okay, so now let's look at it from a perspective of compounding interest. Okay, so I've already got it set up here. I've got my principal, I've got my rate plus 1, and I've got my number of years. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pull up this calculator and show you how this works in terms of compounding interest. Okay, so you can plug this in as well. We have $1,000 again. We're going to multiply that times 1 plus the interest rate, which is 1.2. I've got to use my little exponent function to the 10th power, or over those 10 years. So this investment of $1,000 at 20% interest over 10 years compounded amounts to $6,191.74. And if I subtract the original amount from this, I can see that I've earned $5,191.74, which is substantially more than the $2,000 I earned with my simple interest investment. I would prefer compounding interest if I could invest in any particular financial asset. And here's our amounts again. We have our first amount, which is the $2,000 in interest, and the value of this asset being $3,000. We have our second compounding interest, the future value of this amount being $6,191.74, with a little over $5,000 in interest. You can see that a compounding interest loan is going to far outgain a simple interest loan. Or, said another way, compounding interest will ultimately grow exponentially, whereas simple interest will grow at a constant rate. And that's ultimately what we're looking at when we see the difference between simple and compounding interest. Alright, so now on your paper you have some simple and compounding interest practice. If you guys would pause the video and go ahead and do this, allocate a necessary amount of time, and then ultimately when you see that everybody is kind of done with this, go ahead and replay this and I'll give you the answers. Alright, so hopefully everyone has had ample time to work on this. Let's go ahead and just review these answers. And you can kind of do a once over on your paper here, checking the answers, just making sure everything is as it should be. It looks like these first 5 are simple interest, and these last 5 are compounding interest. So this would be the interest earned on the original amount of principal, and these numbers would reflect the future value of these sums given the interest rate to whatever compounding number we're using. Alright, so let's talk about a price of a bond. Bonds are, of course, essentially an IOU, which is essentially one party lending another party an amount of money and expecting a percentage, a fixed rate of percentage return on that loaned money. So let's say that I have a company that's selling a bond, and this company, we're going to call this company Company X. Company X. And Company X is selling a bond, a $1,000 bond, right? $1,000. And this $1,000 bond is going to pay 10% over the course of 1 year. All right. So if we make a little bit of a timeline, let's just say that this is the year mark. Okay, and this is the original sale of the bond, and the price of the bond is $1,000. Well, if we look at this bond, we're going to pretend that it's paying us twice. It's going to pay us semi-annually. Okay, so it's going to pay us 10% total, but it's going to pay us twice, so essentially 5% here and 5% here. And so what this means is that this bond is going to effectively pay us $50 at the 6-month mark, and then another $50 at the year mark, in addition to the original $1,000 that we loaned to Company X. So let's just say that you buy this bond, right? And you buy this bond, and 1 minute after you buy this bond, that interest rates jump to 20%. The question is, what happens to the value of this bond that you have? What happens to the price of this bond? Well, let's think about it. Let's say that you wanted to sell this bond, right? Like you needed some liquidity, you needed your money back for whatever reason. And so you wanted to sell this bond to somebody else. Are they going to be willing to pay you $1,000 for this bond? And the answer is no. And the reason the answer is no is because essentially the price of this bond needs to be less, right? The price of this bond needs to be less than the original $1,000, because effectively someone else could buy a bond from Company X now and with prevailing interest rates receive a return of 20%. So it should intuitively make sense that someone wouldn't be willing to spend that original $1,000 and only receive a 10% interest rate. They know they can buy that same bond and receive 20%. Okay, so what is the point here? The point is that as the interest rates rise on bonds, the price of the bond fall, as we saw here. As the interest rate jumped from 10 to 20%, my existing bond now is not worth as much. So the price of that bond falls. Okay, so maybe somebody gives you, without getting too crazy with the math, $900 or $800 or something for that bond. And conversely, if interest rates fall, the price of existing bonds rise. For instance, let's say that 1 minute after you buy this bond, interest rates fall to 2%. Well, now you have a bond that's very valuable. You have a bond that's paying 10%, while everybody else can only earn 2%. Okay, so the price of a bond works inversely with interest rates, and that's something you need to know for this class. Okay, moving right along. I have a question for you. My question is this. You just won $1 million in a lottery, and this is going to give you $1 million in 10 years. And you're told you can take a lump sum payment today of $510,000 or just take this money in 10 years. What should you do? Okay, so we're going to assume that the interest rates, prevailing interest rates, will average 7% over the next 10 years. So the answer to this can be expressed mathematically. To do this, we use what's called the present value of a future payment, or the method itself is called discounting. And discounting allows us to look at the present value of some future payment. So I get paid $1 million in 10 years. What is that worth today if I could earn 7% interest in the market? So here's the formula for this. The formula is the present value is equal to X, representing the sum of money, divided by 1 plus the rate to the nth power. Okay, so let's look at a couple examples. We're going to take the present value of $200 in 10 years in today's value. In other words, what will $200, if I was to fast forward 10 years, expressed as a value in today's value? All right, so I just plug in my numbers. I've got my $200. I'm going to divide that by 1.05 to the 10th power, and that gives me $123. $200 in 10 years at 5% interest is like $123 today. All right, how about at 8%? Well, again, just plug it in. 200 divided by 1.08 to the 10th power is equal to $93. So you can see that these numbers represent the value of $200 paid in 10 years at various interest rates. All right, so back to our question. We won the $1 million lottery. We're told we can collect a lump sum payment of $510,000 today. What should we do? So we're going to use 7% as our real interest rate on our investment return. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug this into my calculator. I'm going to take 1 million. I'm going to divide it by 1.07 and then put in my exponent to the 10th power. And the answer is going to be $508,349. So, should I take the $510,000 today? The answer is yes, I should, because this value of $1 million is worth $508,000 today. By taking the $510,000, I've actually seen a net profit. So again, we should take the $510,000 today instead of the $1 million over 10 years because we have a gain of just under $2,000. Okay, so now I'd like you to pause the video and go ahead and do some discounting practice. And after everyone has had a chance to work on this, we'll go over the answers. So please pause the video at this moment. Okay, let's go ahead and review the answers here. With these questions, what you would have done is you would have taken the present value formula, which essentially would tell us how much $100 is worth at various increments. So how much would $100 in 30 years be worth today at a 2% prevailing interest rate, or an 8% prevailing interest rate, or 20% prevailing interest rate? So ultimately, how much would each of these be worth at these different values? And the same goes for this question dealing with a U-Haul business. You're contemplating the purchase of a $40,000 truck, and should you make this purchase based on your expected payments of $12,000 each year? Well, you can see that in this example, the total amount comes to less than the value currently of the value of the truck, so it wouldn't be a good idea to make that endeavor. The same thing goes for this whitewater raft company, and you're still using present value here. Again, you can just check your answers based on these prevailing interest rates. All right, so let's look at a graph here. And this graph represents the average price of a resold home in the United States, and it's indexed based on 1890's prices. So in 1890, the index begins at 100, and effectively anything above this mark is going to represent an increase in prices, and anything below it would represent a decrease in prices of a resold home. All right, so you can see that throughout history, the price and the value of homes certainly declined at different times and rose at different times. So we have like these little gray areas. This is during World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, during the 1970s when there's a little bit of a real estate boom, and the 1980s real estate boom. But I want you to pay close attention to the 2000s, because at the tail end of the 1990s and the early 2000s, we see almost an irrational behavior in the market for homes. So our index goes from 110 to 200 by the mid-2000s. If we were to look at this mathematically, this would be around an 82% increase in price levels. So what cost $100,000 in the late 1990s cost $180,000 in the mid-2000s. Well, this is, again, kind of an irrational behavior that existed during the 2000s relative to the real estate market. And certainly, it was a larger percentage increase in the price of the average home sold and resold in the United States in our U.S. history, or at least since 1890. So this boom in the real estate market was followed by a bust. And you can see that the home prices went from, then again, that high point all the way back down to levels seen right around before the boom. All right, so what do we call this behavior in a market that exists when the economy experiences this irrational increase in price levels? This is referred to as a bubble. And so we refer to this as what we call a speculative bubble. Okay, so let's look at the definition of a bubble and then some examples. A speculative bubble is whenever the price of any given asset rises above what the typical value of that asset is. It's typical for home prices to increase over the years, but is not typical for them to increase by nearly 100%. In South Florida, where I was living prior to moving to the Brunswick area, home prices were increasing in some areas by 200 or 300%. So you can imagine the mania felt by a lot of people that own homes as the value of their homes increased 100, 200, or 300%. We can see different examples of speculative bubbles historically, and I'll show you some examples here in a moment. But what it means to speculate is to sort of guess, right? To think about something and make a guess about it. You're forming an opinion based on what you think the future will be. So if you think that the value of something is going to increase, then you probably are willing to spend money on it or to invest in it, and thus anticipate or speculate a return. And sometimes when we have speculation occur, that speculation is correct, and sometimes it's incorrect. But this exists in all different markets around the world for various assets. So I want to look at a couple more characteristics of speculative bubbles. All right, here we go. So number one, values are highly inflationary. They are well beyond what we typically see for that particular asset. When the asset, quote unquote, pops, metaphorically speaking, then we see major price corrections. This is the downside of the speculative bubble, of course. And certainly if you were one of the people that speculated real estate prices would continue to rise at a rate of 82% or in some regions 200%, well then you are left holding the bag after you purchased these assets at a very, very high price. One of the first classic examples of a speculative bubble was what was known as tulip mania in Europe, Western Europe, from 1634 to 1637. It was one of the first ever speculative bubbles. And they became so popular and so highly inflationary that the story goes that an individual actually traded his home for a tulip bulb. Well, tulip mania, like every other mania and every other speculative bubble, came to a screeching halt, and of course the value of tulips fell tremendously in Europe. The dot-com bubble is another good example, and this one happened here in the United States from around 1997 to 2000. It was during this time that we had a lot of different upstart companies based on the internet and the boom of the internet that caused investors to speculate that they may be the next Google. And during the dot-com bubble, people were willing to put millions of dollars into upstart companies that hadn't shown any kind of profit, but it was with speculation that these companies would do well and potentially become the next billion-dollar company. One classic example was a company called Pets.com. And so this was one of those companies that really didn't show a profit, but it was an online pet supply store, and it actually had a multi-million-dollar Super Bowl commercial and had a balloon during the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. I want to show you a commercial from this, and you can see what I'm talking about. All right, so this was from the Pets.com Super Bowl commercial.
Okay, Dino, I gotta go to a lot of stores to get what you like. I'll be back. If you leave me now, you'll take away the biggest part of me. Ooh, no, baby, please don't go. Ooh, girl, I just want you to stay. Hey, man, I'm getting car sick. I think I'm gonna boot.
That was it, Pets.com, and people were putting lots of money behind that product. But nonetheless, that is, of course, one of the examples of the dot-com era and some of the companies that collapsed. Of course, the real estate bubble we talked about from the late 1990s, early 2000s to around 2005, another example of a speculative bubble. Okay, so the next bubble that I wanted to talk about was the mid-1980 to early 1990s bubble, which I actually grew up and actually was affected by. And this bubble was in the market for comic books. I've shared with you guys before that during my youth I really enjoyed comic books. It was something I really enjoyed collecting. It was something that became a part of my life when I was younger. And I can remember the craze for comic books and the overall mania in the market when people assumed that comic books were just this great place to put your money and this investment tool that you could net a huge return on in the future. So the comic book bubble was another example of this, and so I've got a video clip I want to show you on this guy here. This is Todd McFarlane, and he was famous for innovations in the SpiderMan comic book. He also developed and created this comic book called Spawn. So he today now is in charge of and owns a multi-million-dollar company that makes collectibles, toy collectibles, but nonetheless, Todd McFarlane created and added and benefited from this mania by becoming a very, very wealthy person. Nonetheless, the comic book bubble draws a lot of parallels to some of the existing bubbles that we've seen in our market and ones over history. So let me show you a video clip during the 1990s that'll reflect this.
Part of me just couldn't believe it. Like, this guy is this great, and he wants to come here? Of course.
Spider-Man, when I took over Spider-Man, I thought he was in the doldrums. He was wearing a 60s hairdo, 60s clothes, 60s car. I mean, his girlfriend, his wife at that time, Mary Jane, you know, she was a model, a New York model, but she wore clothes that looked like came from Kmart, and she didn't have, I guess, a curling iron or a blow dryer because her hair was completely limp and straight. I mean, it was, what are you talking about here? So I'm going to make her look like a glamour model, which is what she was, and I'm going to dress the guy up like a current-day 22-year-old photographer in New York City, right?
Marvel books this breath of fresh air as an artist. His work had this insane energy to it. And this was an aberration.
He changed the webbing. He added a lot more webs to the costume. He made the eyes a lot bigger to give it that more of a bug-eyed look. And just a lot more creepier look.
His basic drawing was nonsensical at times. I mean, he draws characters who have no bones. But it's exciting to look at, and it's expressive.
I was getting antsy that I wanted again to write my own books. I was penciling and I was inking, and I want to write. I'm a very curious kid, and I wanted to see if I can do it.
Todd got to get his own Spider-Man title.
McFarlane's first issue sold over 3 million copies, which he says pays the bills. But his true love is baseball.
Yeah, I'm an athlete first, and then I do comic books as a living.
And so you'd go from this normal existence to this comic book existence at a comic book convention where people would scream and, crowd around him and line up for literally hours and hours and hours to get a signature. And talk about surreal.
The more profits soared, the more the sales went up, the more experimental we got. We just kept trying things.
By the end of the 80s, you had comic book fans who were interested in comics as an investment.
I just think we took advantage of them, you know? It's the one thing that I just keep slamming my head against the wall. Just because you can take money, it doesn't... You gotta have a better reason than to take money just because you can. Okay, here we are. We're Curious Comics here. This is... we got... What do you got? You got DC... And then, what about Image Comics other than those terrific Spawn comic books?
Well, yeah, of course, Spawn is the best-selling Image comic.
Oh, yeah, thanks for saying that.
Yeah.
Spawn in 1993 was selling somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million copies. Okay? It now sells 70,000 copies. That's how dramatic the drop has been in the comic book market.
Hey, I'll have to sign some of those Spawn books. You can get rid of them. SpiderMan, you would think.
It is becoming an increasingly antiquated art form. And I believe that it will survive in a much smaller venue. I think in the early 1990s, the industry convinced itself it was rock and roll, stadium rock and roll. Really, it's more like club jazz.
All right, so you can see that during the bubble, there was a tremendous mania for comic books, and by the early 1990s, that had sort of died out. I can actually remember when this happened. For me, I was in 1992. 1993 was when I was in high school. By then, I just stopped caring about comics as much. And so, not only that, there were people that would, during the height of the boom, they would go and they would buy because they thought that a lot of comics were worth something. For instance, on the screen, Spider-Man #1, done by Todd McFarlane, people anticipated, speculated that this would be worth a lot of money, so they would buy 5 or 6 copies. Well, you think about, multiple people buying multiple amounts of comic books, that's going to drive the value up exponentially, and that's what it did. And of course, the upswing that happened during the 80s and 90s came crashing down. Okay, so right now proceed to the back of the note packet and read the article on the crash of 1993, answer the questions, and once you're done, resume this video at this point. Alright, there are a couple of current bubbles that we can look at. Some people say the student loan industry has created a bubble. And you can see this picture right here, the bubble, right, with the graduation cap on it. The editorial cartoon here with the student that's got this debt on his shoulders. We know that today our economy offers very, very low interest rates on borrowed money to go to school, student loans. What's happened as a result is there's a lot of people that previously could not attain an education that now have access to low interest rate loans that can now go to school. The upside of this is that, yeah, we have a lot of people that are getting their degrees and getting an education and furthering their human capital. The downside is that it's creating a surplus in the market of people that have college degrees and have college educations. On top of the fact that people are graduating with mountains of debt, hundreds of thousands of dollars in some cases. So, nonetheless, these are all examples of bubbles that either existed or exist, and they all sort of follow the same pattern of behavior. All right, so we can see it here. This is a general way of looking at it. The original phase where the asset starts to be sold, people start to become aware of this asset. This asset gains media attention, enthusiasm. People begin to see it speculatively as a place they can make a lot of money. Other members jump in the market because they think they're missing out and they might actually have a chance to make money on this thing too. We all, at some point, think that this valuation has created a new paradigm. For instance, the 82% increase in real estate in the United States. So, okay, that's the new normal, right? Then we have the crash that begins and people are in denial. They think, oh, well, it's going to go back to normal. Then you really see the return to normal here. And during this time period, people start to get scared because the assets they own now have a tremendous lower value. Of course, the feeling of despair during this bottoming out point, which I'm sure lots of people felt during the different bubble busts that we've seen. And then finally, maybe return to what it was originally. All right, here's a couple of more examples, some graphs. This is the tulip bulb bubble. So you can see during the 1600s leading up to the boom, and then of course the bust. Here's the dot-com bubble, the big boom in the industry, and then the subsequent bust. Here's the education bubble. So you can see this is the consumer price index since 1990 for various costs of things. We have general price level increases, represented by the yellow bar. We have energy prices, which are certainly more volatile. You would expect that on the blue bar. We have healthcare costs, in the orange bar. And then we have education costs, tuition and fees, in the green bar. And what you notice about that is growing and creating a widening gap since the early 2000s. And that's what you're seeing here. Right now, go ahead and pause the video. And what I would like you to do is watch this video on YouTube on China's speculative bubble. So go ahead and watch that. Once you're done with it, we can return to the lesson. All right, so let's continue our lesson on the financial markets. One of the financial markets that exists to deal with the problem of risk. Everybody has a certain level of what we call risk aversion. Risk aversion is a dislike of things that are uncertain. We think that if we do a certain activity and we don't really know the end result, that something bad could happen, and so we avoid it. And so in finance, people avoid things that could be risky in the sense that they don't want to lose their money. Okay, so a lot of times what I like to do is I like to start off by saying, what's more risky, okay? Jumping out of an airplane, with a parachute, of course, or going bird watching. It's likely that you would say jumping out of a plane. So for me, as an individual, I'm never going to jump out of a plane. You won't catch me doing that. It's just not something I'm interested in doing. I have a certain risk aversion to that. But for an individual that does jump out of a plane versus an individual that goes bird watching, there's going to be a definite different level of risk. However, there's going to be a different level of return, meaning when I jump out of the plane at 4,000 feet or whatever it is, I'm going to get a huge rush. It's going to be exhilarating. My heart's going to pump. My adrenaline's going to flow. The level of return is going to be higher than, let's say, bird watching. All right, so anyhow, if a person is risk averse, they will be likely to avoid certain things that could potentially bring them harm, like jumping out of a plane or like investing in a risky stock. Let's talk quickly about the trade-off between risk and return. All right, risk and return. There is a trade-off that exists between risk and return. In other words, the higher the risk, the higher the potential return. The lower the risk, the lower the potential return. So for instance, some low-risk investments would be something like a bond in the federal government, savings account, something that would be very, very low risk, but would also then in turn pay you very low return. A high risk would be something that is potentially a high return, but it could also cause some volatility in the market you're investing in and subsequently lose your money. Something like a stock in a startup company, let's say, or real estate we've seen as a volatile industry. One way to avoid tremendous risk in a market is by diversifying. And so a lot of financial analysts recommend diversification because it helps reduce the risk of putting all your money into one asset. And when you diversify, essentially what you're doing is you're spreading those assets around. In other words, you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. So this can help to eliminate what we call firm-specific risk, in that we're not putting all our money into one company only to see that company fall out of favor with the market and maybe go bankrupt or what have you. So for instance, like investing in pets.com, putting all your money into that company, it goes out of business, you lose your investment, your total investment. So I would rather invest in multiple companies so that if one does fall out of favor, then it offsets the loss of one with the gain of another. Although we can't totally eliminate risk by diversification, we can again eliminate firm-specific risk, but we cannot eliminate what we call market risk. That is, if the market itself takes a downturn. So here's a definition of these things. Again, firm-specific risk is the uncertainty associated with investing in one particular business, whereas the market risk is the representation of the entire market, all the businesses, the stock market, for instance. Another way to avoid risk would be to insure your assets. To give you an example of how insurance works, there's a whole market for this in the financial sector. It's kind of like this. Let's say that I have a pool of people, and all of these people want to spread the risk of, let's say, driving, right? And so we get into cars every day and we assume we're not going to get in an accident, but we could. And so if I do get in an accident, rather than absorbing the whole impact of that accident financially, maybe we can share the risk here so that if, like, say, one person gets in an accident, we all sort of pay into that person's recovery, damages, or whatever. These pool of people, right, and they all have cars, they're going to pay into this insurance, and they're going to pay, let's say, Geico, a pool of money. So they're going to pool their money together and each pay a little bit of money every month. All right, so let's say one of these people gets into an accident. So let's say the accident costs $5,000. Well, let's say this one person that got in the accident, they're going to end up paying what's called the deductible. The deductible is the amount that they have to come up with prior to insurance company picking up the remainder of the money. Now, some deductibles can be high, some can be low, but an average deductible would be around $500. So let's say this person pays the 500 bucks. Now this pool of money is going to cover the rest. And so Geico, let's say, is the company. They're going to pick up the remainder of the money, and what they're going to do is they're going to fund the remainder of the money to fix the car. So this person ends up paying $500. This insurance company picks up the remaining $4,500. And that's how insurance works. And you can buy insurance on virtually anything that you own. On your home, you can buy it on financial assets. Wealthy people even insure, like, let's say, a singer insures their voice, or an athlete insures their legs. You can insure almost anything in our economy. One way to deal with risk is to buy insurance. And so what happens is a person that is facing the risk pays a fee to the insurance company, and the insurance company then absorbs the potential risk that is involved in the endeavor. Like I said before, there's different types of insurance. There's auto insurance, there's fire insurance, there's health insurance, there's dental insurance, etc. So insurance is a gamble because you may never get into a car accident. You may never get sick. You may never have a flood or a fire or whatever. So at some level, you might pay into this industry for your entire life and never use it. But you pay it to receive a peace of mind, and that's the ultimate goal behind insurance. So why do we have insurance? The role of insurance, again, is not to eliminate total risk, to spread risk around more efficiently. And economists like to say there's two problems with the markets for insurance. Number one, what's called adverse selection. Adverse selection is the notion that a person that is high risk is more likely to apply for insurance than a person is low risk. For instance, someone that lives on the Atlantic Ocean is likely to apply for flood insurance because they know there's a chance that something could happen that could damage their house relative to a flood. Well, if this is the case, then it's possible that this house would also then have a claim for a flood. And so for an insurance company, this is a little bit of a problem because the revenue generated from that person also puts them at risk of having to pay for that person's potential claim. Or it might be like saying someone that drives really fast and recklessly needs insurance in the event they get in an accident. There's also another concept that we could look at for the problems with insurance market, and that's called moral hazard. Moral hazard is the idea that once people do have this insurance, that they act more recklessly. Okay, now I have fire insurance, so I'm going to smoke a cigarette in my house, and I'm going to leave the cigarette on the table even though it's burning. If it burns, big deal, I got fire insurance. All right, I got car insurance, so I'm going to drive around really fast, and I'm not going to pay attention to stop signs and stoplights. Okay, I got life insurance, so now I'm going to jump out of a plane at 4,000 feet. No big deal. All right, again, moral hazard is the idea that people, once they own the insurance, have less incentive to be careful. Now, these two things affect the price of insurance. And I have a couple pictures here to show you how this works too. All right, this is the area that I'm from, which is southeast Florida. And this is along I-95 south going towards Miami. And you can see that there is markedly more individuals in their automobiles than in this picture here. So this picture is very likely to be one of my commutes on a day-to-day basis to work back when I lived in the southeast Florida region. So this picture to the right is a picture of my commute today. And so this is off of 82 out there, you know, by 95 by the Oasis. And so you can see that there's just not as many cars. You've got 8 million people that live in the Tri-County area of South Florida. You've got 80,000 people that live here. One of the things that this is going to reflect is the price of insurance as a result. And so over here, we have a lot of people. The likelihood of an accident is high. Well, insurance is going to be more expensive. Over here, a lot less people. The likelihood of an accident is lower. Insurance prices will be lower. My wife and I paid over $500 for insurance when we lived in South Florida. Here we pay about $100. And so you can certainly draw the assumption that auto insurance in South Florida is higher than in South Georgia. Okay, so that is a lesson on chapter 27. Okay, so proceed to the follow-up work, which you can see displayed on the screen. That includes chapter 27 worksheet, the problems and applications question for review, as well as the open notes quiz. And also, students, if you would, bring your books. After this lesson is done, bring your books the following day. And what I want you to do is take the pre-quiz for the next chapter that we're going to look at, which is chapter 29. So bring your books, and you can do that in class during one of the class periods rather than having to do that at home.